Why horror? That is, why is horror fiction, novels, movies, TV shows, comics, the like, why is it so popular? Because I'll confess, I did not understand the appeal. As a child and youth, I only got nightmares from it, not the sense of joy or excitement our reading spoke about. And yet, I know people who do feel that way. I still don't feel that way. My confession is that I do not enjoy horror or scary movies. Not the way that I sense other people do, at least, some people. As a kid, they were just too scary for me. As an adult, I do enjoy the movies for their themes, and I'm going to say a lot more about that in a second. But I still especially don't like the jump scare. The moment when something jumps or something abrupt happens, often punctuated by loud sound or music, intended to surprise you and make you jump, hence the name. And I don't like being scared. And as I keep saying, I know from friends and family that there are people who seem to really enjoy it. And so I get it, I think, but it's not for me. But I will say the thing that brought me around to appreciation, if not enjoyment at least, of horror movies and horror fiction was as a young adult in college, a teacher, a professor of English at my alma mater, the University of Houston. She really opened our eyes to this, my eyes. One of the novels we read in her class was Dracula, the original novel by Bram Stoker, which has had, of course, a billion riffs and competitors and inspired bys. But I will say that the original, if you've never read it, is deeper and more interesting and more layered and frankly just better than any of its adaptation, and I'll argue any vampire fiction that has followed it in some 125 years now. I believe it's actually just objectively a really good novel in and of itself. And that often gets overshadowed because of the huge vampire industry it has spawned. So I want to talk to you just a little bit about the novel itself. If you haven't read it, and many people have not, it's good. It's really good. And it's also quite weird. Part of that is its context. It's a 19th century British novel, which is a very different society and world from that we live in now. It has a number of its obsessions, some of which we still share today, but in very different ways. The novel, and indeed that time period, had just an obsession with technology, with railroads and things like timetables for that railroad, because before the railroads, what time something would show up was A, much harder to gauge, and also sort of much less important. The stagecoach would get there when it got there, right? And if you knew the day it was supposed to arrive, that was probably good enough. But the advent of the railroad meant you needed to know not even just the hour, but ideally the minute it was going to show up. There's an obsession with the very earliest audio recording technology, these sort of wax things. We're still pretty obsessed with audio recording technology. It looks extremely different now, and it's changed multiple times just during my lifetime, from 8-tracks and records to cassette tapes to CDs to getting rid of all physical media. Now it's entirely online. And of course there's technology too we're still obsessed with, things like robots and artificial intelligence, which the novel could not have even imagined. But it's a similar vein of concerns. There's also, and this is really interesting I think and still very contemporary, the novel has a lot of concern about bodily autonomy. Vampires, of course, are a classic example of someone literally violating another body, sucking out blood. Today, we only need to go to our own Supreme Court to see violations of bodily autonomy. In Dracula, there are simultaneous concerns about the old world as opposed to modern Britain. The old world symbolized by vampires and Transylvania and this sort of rural, strange, exotic Eastern Europe. There's also concerns about the new world, that is America, which are brought to life by an American character who plays a pivotal role. A lot of people forget that. There's actually a very prominent American character in the Dracula novel. Today, we might couch these sort of concerns in the form of immigration. Other nations and peoples cast as a threat to our way of life. We hear this concern articulated all the time in our political discourse, both in our country and around the world. In the novel, there is also, and constantly, the terrifying prospect of female sexuality, which the Victorians were obsessed with. Controlling, that is. They were obsessed with controlling it. And I wish I could say that that was no longer a concern in our world, but I don't think we can say that. So the novel Dracula's brilliance is to bring all of these things together in one cohesive and rather long story, by the way. It's not a short novel. And it's one that layers all these levels of meaning with a really compelling story of conflict and travel and personal desires and relationships. I've said it several times, so I'm just going to say it one more time. I really recommend you read it if you have any interest in doing so. It's really good. And so the writers of our reading today, who, by the way, are scientists, they are researchers who have studied the appeal of horror fiction. They are both scientists and obviously fans of horror fiction themselves. But I do think they miss something about this. That part of the appeal of horror fiction is that though it is fantastical in the sense that the problem, whether it's a natural disaster or a monster or aliens or a phantasm or what have you, the problem is so extreme as to be unbelievable. It is simultaneously extremely believable because these are real fears and concerns that have been amped up and transformed into monsters. One of my favorites is the Swamp Thing, which is nature literally given form and taking its revenge upon us, who are doing damage to nature. And so, back to Dracula for a second. In the fictional frame of the novel, all of the information is second or third hand. It all comes from diary entries and letters and newspaper articles and wax recordings of people being interviewed, transcripts of those interviews. Everything, in other words, is from a secondary source. And so part of the question throughout is, what information can you really trust? What can you really believe? It's a form of the unreliable narrator. Throughout the novel, we're left to wonder what is really true, which is just a great meta theme for horror fiction. Can you trust what you think you know? Can we trust our own observations? I think, to give a more contemporary example of the film The Blair Witch Project, which was filmed not very far from here, just in rural Maryland, rather, in which we are told that this is found video footage, and the footage is incomplete. And we aren't sure if we can trust what the people speaking on that footage say, and we don't see a whole lot. Mostly, the film is famous for having these shots up close of someone's face, and that's your entire viewpoint. So, to go back 125 years again, some contemporary reviewers of the novel Dracula didn't like it because they worried, and this is true, that it was, quote, too scary. Now, this seems absurd today in several ways. I don't find it to be a particularly frightening or gory novel by today's standards at all. But then I suppose things are never as shocking to the next generation as they are to ours, are they? I showed my children recently, because they begged for it, I showed them the movie Alien. I thought they were a little young for it. Kristen disagreed. I remember being terrified by the movie as a child and having nightmares, and they were just so bored the entire time. So bored. Anyway. So lest I spend all my time talking about century-old horror fiction, I'll give some more modern examples. In horror, the monsters are creations of our own making. Literally, of course, in the sense that someone writes these pieces of fiction into existence. But more importantly, the monsters of horror fiction are real problems taken to a great extreme. Sometimes they're the worst aspects of our own psyche. Think The Shining. In fact, think of any Stephen King work, pretty much. He really likes to explore the fears that are inside our own heads brought to life as physical manifestations. Or of films like The Village, which combine elements of things inside our head with real societal issues, like medical abuse. And as in our time for all ages today, the monsters are often, as Grover found out, the monsters are ourselves. Grover seems to take that in a very positive spirit, by the way. Good for him. In horror fiction, that does not turn out to be good news, usually. The fact that you are your own monster is not a good sign. I can't say enough about this, that horror fiction is compelling because it magnifies real fears. You can tell a lot about a moment in history by looking at its horror fiction. It's not a coincidence that movies about aliens took off during the space race. So let's take a look at our present moment, more or less, the last few years anyway. One of my favorite horror movies of recent vintage, and I'll try not to spoil the plot for you if you haven't seen it, is Get Out, in which the horror, the ultimate antagonist, sometimes represented in a person, but really it's actually racism. It's white supremacy. And the movie, which is absolutely brilliant, by the way, shows audiences what it is like in some very limited but very real way, what it is like to live in our society in a black body, and how that is a horror in many ways. It's an absolutely brilliant film, one I recommend anyone, but especially Unitarian Universalists, to see. And so before researching, to give a different example, before researching for the sermon, I didn't know there was actually a specific name for the subgenre in which nature or the world or the universe strikes back at us for our sins. But there is. It's called eco-horror. And perhaps not at all surprisingly, eco-horror has been extremely prominent in recent years, for the last couple decades especially, as we have increasingly learned about climate change and its accompanying effects. Though as I thought about that more, having said that, eco-horror is probably perhaps the oldest genre on earth too, because if Noah and the Ark and the Great Flood are anything, it's an eco-horror tale. But to give more recent examples, you might think of movies like Waterworld, or 2012, or The Day After Tomorrow, Snowpiercer, as prominent climate change horror movies. Or think of Jurassic Park, about the dangers of DNA technology. And then, of course, there are slightly less recent classics like The Birds or Jaws, which feature nature taking its revenge upon us. In other words, friends, we face real monsters in our lives every day. They aren't the horror movie creations that we can go enjoy in the theaters or in your local library, but they're all the more scary, in my opinion, for being real. Whether it's nature getting us back for what we have done to our world, or the things inside our own minds attacking us, or any of the real societal problems that are often easier to dramatize than to deal with. Horror fiction lets us look at real fears through the lens of art. And it can give us insight into ourselves and our world. And for some of you wonderful folks, it is apparently an enjoyable thing to do too. So enjoy that. The real thing is that there are no monsters that we cannot face together. There is no challenge too great that we cannot support one another against. Because the monster at the end of this book, whatever book it is It may not be as lovable as furry old Grover, but every monster is one that we can face together. So may it be.